All right, we have a special guest today. It's Matt Ralph, famous from his work with the Brotherly Game and, of course, other things before that. But that's how I know you, Matt. And some news has popped up recently and then disappeared. And it came from a Philly kind of a place. And so I, of course, went straight to you. I'm, of course, talking about the fact that Aaron Hurd popped up for a second as being part of the St. Louis City SC academy that was about to be announced. And today that announcement is happening and has come out, and we can talk about it finally, right? And so I wanted to bring you in because you knew stuff about him immediately, saw your name on a few articles. And so yeah, let's first of all welcome. It's nice to chat with you again, but maybe you can fill us in on Aaron Hurd a little bit.
Great. Well, it's good to be here, Phil, and to talk about St. Louis Soccer, a new team that's coming in, and it's exciting just to hear. Obviously these teams come in and they have different ideas about how to build their club, about how to build their brand, and it's exciting to kind of see how St. Louis City is going about like building the academy. Because obviously here in Philadelphia, we've seen so much success from that model, and just in terms of like just academy success, like not even talking about the first team and how it's impacted,
Yeah.
just what that's meant in terms of how it's raised the level of youth development here in our region, how it's produced some great players for the first team, but also for college programs and other teams like you see with Tomas Romero right now in LAFC. And so Aaron Hurd, it's interesting because when Aaron came to the academy 2 years ago now, I was kind of torn about him because he's so young. And I generally don't like to talk about players that are, pre full field players. So generally, you won't hear me talking about U12 players or U11 players or
Yeah.
U10 or. I mean, we can talk about my son and how he's developing. I guess he's 5, but I just, I feel a little. It feels a little uncomfortable to really, certainly to hype a player who's so young. But Aaron came in and he was playing a couple age groups up already with the U15s, and he's the type of player when you see him play, you're like, you kind of throw that out the window a little bit because you're just, I'm like, don't hype up a kid, don't hype up a kid. And then you watch him play, and you're like, holy cow, this kid has a lot of the tools. And even before he came, and I saw him, this time every summer, I kind of do a story on, who are the new recruits to the academy and who's coming in. And I talk with the talent ID guy, John Shear, who's a great guy to talk to. And, he's very passionate about his work, and he loves to talk about the new players that he's gotten into the academy. And,
Nice.
Perfect. Obviously it's not just him, but, he's sort of can be the spokesman for that. And it really is a club-wide effort. I mean, all these recruits that come in, pretty much, get a chance to go to first team training. They meet head coach Jim Curtin. It's really kind of a whole, like they have a whole process for how they bring in players.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it was kind of immediately, this is one we're really, really excited about. And, coming from Maryland, he was a player with Bethesda SC, which is one of the regional independent clubs here. That's really just a great club. They've produced a lot of really wonderful players. You see them, on college, D1 college rosters. You'll see players that have moved on to MLS academies from that club. So, kind of came in with a good pedigree and was already playing up. And, sometimes like I think we do tend to, hype up players because they're playing up a couple age groups naturally.
Yeah.
But he clearly, for the beginning, like I said, he fit in, and it was just really, really exciting player to watch. And a lot of times, like academy players too, it's like, oh, this kid scored a bunch of goals, and that's great. But he's not like Aaron is a type of player from what I've seen who scores goals, like not because he's a goal scorer, but just because he's like, I mean, he's kind of like he's just got such a great work rate. He's all over the field. He's able to, he really is like a box to box midfielder who has just a huge, like just such a great motor. And, for his age, like he's shown so much maturity, and, he's just very, he's not, it's like, you compare him maybe to like Jamiro Montero.
Nice. Yeah.
Type of player, right? Where these guys who just kind of keep their head down and just, get the job done. So,
Yeah,
Yeah,
here's a quote actually that Stuart found online. Box to box was able to control the midfield against older kids, very poised and played well within himself. The kind of flashy that entirely comes from his play and not how he carries himself. You know who wrote that one?
sounds like something I'd say.
Yeah, that's you wrote that. I thought it was well phrased. It was really cool. We were talking about him, and I think I was like, who can we compare him to? You kind of said like a Moses Nyman, but maybe better, higher ceiling even. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean Moses is a player that I just he's one of my favorite young players right now.
Yeah,
I mean he's
agreed.
again like a similar thing where the first there had been a fair amount of hype about him before I saw him play, and I got to see him playing in GA Cup against the Union, and then I went out to see him play against FC Delco, and again, like some of these kids get hyped up, and you're like, your first look at them is like, okay, like he's like half the size of everyone else, and like it's natural, right? And then you're like, oh, and then you see them. A similar thing with Moses. You see him on the ball, you see just his intelligence, and it's just like, oh wow, this guy is special. Now you see him at the MLS level, and just how in command he is as such a young player is really impressive. So definitely kind of like in terms of like positioning, and again that whatever you want to call it, that the it factor or whatever, it's definitely there in terms of obviously the talent and stuff, but then with a lot of these players, right, it comes down to like the development plan, and like what is the plan for a player, because again, following the Union Academy for probably about 7 years now really closely, there's a lot of players that come through that have that kind of jump off the page, and then you see, unfortunately, a lot of times it's forwards, right? They just don't develop, right? Forwards are really, really hard to develop in this country and probably around the world. That's why they get paid so much. But so you'll see players who are bigger who score like 30 goals, and then the rest of the kids catch up to them, and then you're like, you see, okay, well, there was some deficiencies elsewhere that weren't really addressed. So certainly in this country, the development of player like central midfielders is something we're finding some success with now. So it's
especially his type of position. Yeah, that makes sense.
He
you mentioned earlier that he's from Bethesda FC in Maryland, and he's listed on our roster that drops today as being from Virginia. So obviously that's not in the Philly homegrown area. And so I want to talk about that. Because obviously Philly is a great model for an academy. Of course, we want to kind of copy a lot of those kind of things if we had our choice here as fans in St. Louis. And it's interesting. Can you talk to me about how Philly has brought people in from not just the U.S., but like all over the world, right, to bring into their academy and claim them as homegrown someday? It looks like St. Louis is kind of, we're going to be ruthless in the same kind of way, if you want to phrase it that way. And I'm curious, can you kind of tell us, everything about Philly? I'm curious about some of those examples or how they go about it. You mentioned Jim Curtin going about bringing people in earlier too. So
yeah. I mean, the recruiting aspect is one that probably Kansas City that first sort of came on the radar for this.
The new
obviously
North Carolina boys, right?
Yeah, and well, even before that was Saloy, right? I mean, being an exchange student, and a lot of people around the league are like, what kind of looking at Peter Vermes, like what fast one is he pulling with this exchange student homegrown? So that was sort of like you saw Kansas City kind of leading a little bit of the charge of that, but all along, actually, Philadelphia has been. It's been since early in their full-time academy days, because their first sort of toe in the water with this in 2010 was, kind of unfortunately what Minnesota is doing with the kind of regional, club and country model, a country club model or whatever you want to call it, where they had basically, because Philadelphia and John Hackworth was the guy that kind of put this together. No one talks about how John Hackworth really built the foundation for what the Union are doing now.
Who is in St. Louis now?
yes, exactly. So that's
rumored.
That's an important, I guess they haven't announced it, but that's an important piece of this, right? And it's
Mhm.
important to let people know in St. Louis that this is in John Hackworth's wheelhouse. And so he was kind of the guy who set about to, look at the clubs in the area and say, like, hey, look, we're trying to build this academy. The best way to start, because just to start a team is tough, especially in a place like Philly where you have so many established youth clubs, so much history. I mean, you go back and like our history in youth development dates back to the early part of the 19th or 20th century, and
Mhm.
Lighthouse is one of the famous youth clubs in the country, right? That built some of these players like Walt Barr and some of these other like legends of the game. So there's a lot of history in Philly, and so John Hackworth kind of like created this model where you had players from FC Delco, players from PDA, players from PA Classics coming in, and they had like a training model where they would come in and then they'd put teams together like they did with that successful 2012 GA Cup team that Zach Steffen was a goalkeeper for, and they
Yeah.
won on penalties to beat Toronto in the final out, and I think it was in Seattle at the time in 2012. And Jim Curtin was the head coach of that team, so really was like like I said, John Hackworth kind of putting that together, and then they kind of built on that model with the joining the DA, the Development Academy, in 2013, and that was when they really kind of started this program. That's when they officially opened YSC Academy, the school. They had kind of a sort of like what LA Galaxy has, like a sort of like a training, like a learning center model before that. And then they decided,
Mhm.
Richie Graham and company decided that, the best model was to actually have like a fully functioning high school complete with lockers that have
Yeah.
the Union logo on them. So that was, I think, probably just, again, they were building a foundation, and they didn't produce a whole lot of players from that. It was early days. Unfortunately, they had a chance to sign Zach Steffen, and that didn't happen. But then, you saw Zach Pfeffer, Jimmy McLaughlin, who's still kicking it at Louisville, and
It's
then
true.
Christian Hernandez, which was a weird Peter Novak invention, kind of skirting the MLS rules for that one. So so early on in the actual like DA phase of the program, they had a scout based in Michigan, and they had a guy who's now with Inter Miami, who was really heavily involved in recruiting players. And so you saw players early in the days like Raheem Taylor Parks coming in from out of the area. You saw a host of other players who Justin McMaster was a player who was recruited to the academy, who's
Yeah.
now with
So
Minnesota United.
haven't they brought in guys from like other countries as well to at least start in the academy? I don't know if they claim them as homegrowns or anything, but I thought that was something else that was pretty big with them.
I mean, internationally is a little tricky
Yeah.
because they need an ITC, and so unless there's like Patrick Bowie, who's with Cincinnati. He's one of those ones where he was part of the academy long before he could play because of
Yeah.
ITC clearance. So he actually made his debut in the GA Cup, which is it's not the DA. So he was able to play in an MLS event, kind of like as a guest player. Then they were able to kind of clear him.
Mhm.
He had a parent in the U.S. So a lot of these players that
Okay.
are internet, like they have an international. Jaron Nixon was a player earlier in the days of the academy. His dad was a Trinidad and Tobago legend, so
Okay.
yeah, relocated to Georgia. So early they had some hot spots like before these teams started, like Georgia, where they got Joseph Samuel, who's playing internationally now. Florida, Michigan, they were able to kind of target some of these locations where there weren't clubs.
But
To
this
bring
isn't
in.
something that's happening like regularly. That's something I meant to ask you about before we
Yeah.
started, but that's good to know. Because everyone's gonna get away with what they can, obviously, as you've illustrated multiple times already. One thing I wanted to ask you about was Minnesota United. You mentioned their model, and then obviously you guys have a full model. You mentioned high school and everything, right? So St. Louis City, interestingly, is doing kind of what Hackworth is doing in that way. I know that's what it was doing. And I know that's one reason they brought him in. I think our sporting director, Lutz Pfannenstiel, that was his idea too, as well, to kind of bring in from already existing academies in the area, right? And so we're only going to have like a U15 and up as far as official MLS Academy players. and then below that they're going to pull from the local academies. Is that exactly what Minnesota's doing, or is that a little different, like maybe a hybrid of what you guys are?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, yeah, with Minnesota is they're really kind of letting the local clubs develop the players, and then they'll bring them in for tournaments or events and that kind of thing.
Okay.
I haven't. I mean, lately, information about other academies since the MLS Next started is a little bit murky in terms of like figuring out the structure with COVID and stuff. But that was my
Mhm.
understanding. Is it's not exactly the club and country model that the Union had, but it's has a similar feel where you're kind of putting a lot of the like day to day training games on weekends on the local clubs, and then you're sort of bringing them into your environment to kind of add additional training, add additional opportunities for tournaments. And that's actually been to the Union's benefit with Bijan Darbo, considered one of the top prospects at that age. He's playing with the Union too, and playing with the U17. So he was one, and several like Columbus got a couple guys. Like, I mean, basically all of the a lot of the players they had that were top prospects kind of scattered after that announcement came down. So yeah, I mean, it's been beneficial to
Yeah.
to the Union, but it's a different and I mean, I'm not a fan of one size fits all. So I think
Agreed.
if that's what they've figured out is good for them, that's good for them. It's sad when you see a guy like Caden Clark not playing for Minnesota United, and a guy like Bijan not going with the local team. So even though it does benefit in this case, for the Union or for Red Bulls, there's something really cool about these players that coming up with their local team, but also if it's not a good fit, that they have an opportunity elsewhere to sort of maybe be in
Yeah.
a different system. The territory thing, I kind of go back and forth on, like, is it fair from a free market standpoint? No, to like just like automatically arbitrarily assign a kid to a team
Yeah.
based on what their address is. But at the same time, like, I think, you know, teams should try to there should be like an ideal situation for teams to have like for kids to have a chance who want to play for their local club to have that opportunity. And I don't know how you work that out with all the Byzantine rules of MLS,
I
but that
know.
is something that I'm interested in. Generally, I love I'm like such a local newspaper guy, like the good local story. Whatever possible. But I recognize too, though, that the teams are going to have different identities and different approaches that are going to benefit, one player over another, depending on their skill set.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts? I got out what I wanted to hear about. I wanted to hear about Aaron. I wanted to hear what your thoughts were about Minnesota United's kind of model versus Union's versus St. Louis's. Any other thoughts before we go for fans of a new expansion club?
Yeah, I think the schooling model is something that I would love to see more teams pick up on, because that's really a big factor that the Philadelphia Union has. Maybe they don't want me talking about this, but that's been a feather in their hat. Is like, ultimately, when you're talking to parents, and I have two children. You're a parent, like thinking about like sending your kid across country for at 14 or whatever.
Yeah.
The thought that they're gonna be in an academic environment that's like structured around training, 2 training sessions a day, and that the people that they have at that school are just very very invested. I mean, they're fans of their soccer, but they're mostly invested just in them as people,
Yeah.
in them like pursuing like their interests, and academically and otherwise, just hobbies outside of soccer. And so I think that model has been really beneficial, just to have these kids like have their individual education plans on top of their individual development plans as players. And I would love to see more teams having their own little schools like that really that really, because this whole like the idea of you go to a school somewhere and then you travel to training every day, like I just think it gets clunky. And residency programs, which the Union have, that could be fraught with all sorts of things that that's a piece I think that all the teams that do it are probably constantly trying to work through. Like, how do you create a residency program that's that works, that doesn't, it's sort of like, how do you get a bunch of boys living together and not have problems? And then when problems arise, how do you address some of just the social,
of course,
social aspects of things, the pressures that, there's just immense pressure on these kids. I just can't, I can't imagine the pressure that they're under, and they sign up for it, right? So
yeah, exactly.
But at the same time, again, like looking at all the other aspects of their as individuals, and I really do look at these young people as individuals. I root for them, to do well at whatever they pursue, and I want what's best for these young people, because I recognize that they're not really normal kids. I tell them that, like, when I talk, I'm like, you're not normal. Like, maybe you don't need me telling you that, but like, you have, you're doing something really awesome. Like, I think the kids that we celebrate are the kids that like rise, like the cream rises to the top.
Yeah.
But like all of them, I think, are worth celebrating in the sense that they're doing a part in building the game in this country, and they're setting an example for the younger kids of like, this is what it looks like to basically train as a professional at 14, at 15, at 16. This is what it's like to balance school and life and stay out of trouble and all of those things.
Be humble.
Be humble. Yeah, that's a huge part of it, because
totally,
the game will humble you at some point. So you might as well work on the humility before you get to there.
Absolutely. Yeah, they should wear it as a badge of honor. I completely agree. And I love your input about all of the academy stuff. You've been around the block. Obviously, you're very invested, and you enjoy knowing and talking to all these kids and the parents and coaches and everything. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me. Matt Ralph of the Brotherly Game. It's always fun, and I'm sure we'll be talking again in the future.
Great. Yeah. And I just, one other thing to add was, the St. Louis folks were we're here at a game at our training field down in Chester. And that was cool to see again, that sharing of information that I think is so important. So, and I know there's a connection between Ernst and the sporting director there, and some people involved in the team, but it's just really cool to kind of see how there is such a collaboration across the league. Obviously it's a single entity league, like, there's, structurally it is, but that doesn't mean these guys have to talk to each other.
No, not at all.
So it's always great when they do, and they build those relationships, because again, I think they're all together can raise the level of the game, not just for MLS, but certainly for USL and for NISA and these other leagues that are so important to the game.
Completely agree. Yeah, they did take that trip to Philly and DC and Kansas City. I'm not sure what else, but picking some good ones there for sure. So, all right, man. Thanks again, Matt. We'll talk soon.